you're friends with Charles Taylor, and you take if you look at what goes into the modern identity in terms of sensitivity to suffering, and,
human rights, and so on.
Dignity. I mean, so much of what is admirable in global political aspirations today are not emerge out of the modern context in certain ways. So, but in turn, it seems as if Gandhi in some ways relied on a certain moral center within the British people to be responsive to the aspirations and the suffering of Indians, just as King did in the American people. If we look at what's happening, if we take as test cases, World War II is certainly this huge. I mean, Hitler and the Nazis were in some sense possessed, and would have probably have stopped at nothing.
Sure.
And then if we look at our right now the test cases of the Arab Spring, what do we do in terms of, yes, this happened in Tunisia and Libya, but there was a very interesting program.
Egypt.
Sorry.
We hope it'll happen in Libya.
In Tunisia and Egypt. But there was a very interesting thing this weekend in which passing around the internet in Arab countries, as well as spontaneously seen in the U.S., it seems like there's this kind of 12-step way in which dictators are responding to the people's revolts in the Middle East and North Africa. And first they try cutting off the internet, then they do this, that, then they give a speech, patronizing speech to the young, etc. But eventually, they, in those two cases, they resigned, they got out. But the other dictators seem to be realizing from these standards that were set by the steps of the other ones, what not to do, and they're violent repression by not bringing in the okay. So, what is the hope for a Gandhian political ethic when you have a Hitler or a Gaddafi?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as Robert pointed out, this exchange between Martin Buber and Gandhi, which is a fascinating exchange, was precisely about Hitler, where Gandhi suggested that the Jews should have organized and organized early, and Buber, with not too much delicacy, says, Mr. Gandhi, you're fairly ignorant about what Hitler's like and what the Nazis are like. So I think it's important to make two or three clarifications. First of all, this is the method of nonviolence is not just a tactic or a strategy that is bound for success. There have been many attempts where Gandhi would recognize that it would lead to apparent failure. All right. So the Gandhian test was not one of immediate empirical success. It was fidelity, all right, to a certain ideal, with the hope. I mean, he wasn't just a pie-eyed, now taking the other end of that dilemma. He wasn't just a pie-eyed idealist who said, we can sort of turn people's hearts around, because the whole principle of satyagraha was to say, no, we're going to keep their feet to the fire, all right? We are going to be defeated. So, for example, if we take a perfect example of a failure of the Gandhian method, the Chinese student revolt in Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese government at that time just brutally sent in tanks and killed the students, and where they are now, both in Tibet and elsewhere, just following the methods, the playbook that you were citing. The Gandhian hope is, and please note, it's a hope. It's no guarantee of success. The Gandhian hope is that with creative people's resistance, whether it's through the internet or whether it is through different forms of political organization, you just build up pressure, right? And in some sense, that is what Aung San Suu Kyi, one of the great heroines of our time, who has been locked up in Myanmar for the last 12 or 15 years till very recently, and even now is just allowed a very narrow sort of scope of freedom, is someone who is hoping through this relentless, slow, steady pressure to sort of change people's minds. All right. So another point that I think we need to emphasize is that Gandhian nonviolence goes quite deep. It's not just physical force. So, for example, Gandhi says, look, suppose you have a situation of a policeman who is faced with someone who's gone berserk in a restaurant or whatever it is, which we in America know all the time. And if the only way of stopping this, this assassin gone mad is by shooting him, then that's what you have to do. So it's a surgical violence, if you want, done as a last resort with the utmost reluctance, but if the situation demands it. So in that sense, Gandhi was not, this is a misunderstanding of Gandhi, an absolute pacifist, because for him, nonviolence was not just expressed through physical force. Yet another example. Suppose you have a mother holding a small child who's very restless and continually escaping the mother's or the parent's grasp, and is now rushing into traffic, all right? And the mother yanks the child away from the oncoming traffic, and let's say slaps its hand as a way of getting its attention, all right? The intention is one of love, even though there's a slapping of the hand to get the child's attention. So it's not the idea of violence at the overt level, all right? It's the violence of the heart that can be expressed through word, through intention, that Gandhi was really after. So it's important to understand that, because Gandhi felt that there might be regrettable situations, all right? And he might reluctantly, clearly he didn't know the situation in Germany. He might reluctantly have come around to the idea that there was really no alternative but to, and it's very interesting. I should mention this because nothing in the field of ethics is very clear-cut. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian, studied in New York under Reinhold Niebuhr, and was clearly recognized as one of the most brilliant students of Christian ethics. So brilliant was he that people were offering him, very prestigious professorships in 1935, 36. But Bonhoeffer said he was really torn between two courses of action. One was to go to Gandhi and see what Gandhi might say, all right? And for various reasons that did not happen, and Bonhoeffer went back to Germany. And as he sort of got involved with the German struggle, all right, he saw that the only Christian alternative for him was to engage in an assassination plot against Hitler. This was a plot involving very high-level people, academics, generals, and so on. To Bonhoeffer's and the world's bad luck, the plot was discovered, and 10 days before the Allies marched into Berlin, Bonhoeffer was executed, 10 days before. So, but the point is this, that here was a man who was struggling with the sort of Gandhian method, all right, and who, whether Gandhi would have approved or not is a different question, but I think he would have made a convincing case to Gandhi that in that particular case, when all resistance against Hitler seemed to have crumbled, short of the Allies coming in, that he, as a Christian, could do. Now, I would find it that conversation between Gandhi and Bonhoeffer, the imaginary conversation, would have been fascinating. Where Bonhoeffer would have made the case on Christian grounds for joining in an assassination plot. All right, I can't see Gandhi agreeing to it, but I can see Gandhi sort of appreciating the sentiment that violence is a matter sometimes that is forced on us. And Gandhi himself, when the Pakistan army, soon after independence, came into Kashmir, had no hesitation in saying they should be driven out. And he knew quite clearly that driving the army out would involve bloodshed and, the use of military power. So it's important to see that he was not an absolute pacifist, that his principles of nonviolence really go deeper into nonviolence of the heart, nonviolence of word, nonviolence of intention, all right, rather than just the use of physical force or violence. Yeah. Other questions? Please.
I'm wondering, what do you think would be a catalyst or a sort of fulcrum point where nonviolent protests would turn into authentic social reform? Considering the situation nowadays and the solution of the middle class, like you were saying, puts pressure on people, and eventually they're going to react to that. There's a way, there's already been people for anti-nuclear weapons, anti-nuclear power fasting, but it's just something that, like, I've heard casually on NPR. It's not really something you would see in the news or like New York Times or something like that. But if enough people feel the pressure of wanting to do something about the situations, I think a lot of world situations are based in this country, and starting here would affect the rest of the world. So, like, what in your mind would catalyze like a real social reform from nonviolent protest?
Well, I mean, it allows me to comment on something that Robert brought up. You're right. I mean, obviously, we don't live in an industrial civilization, with manufacturing and so on. That moment has passed. But the imperative, the drive behind capitalism, still continues. In other words, the idea that we have to find markets, and so, in a sense, one of the tragedies that I think we face is our addiction to oil, which drives us into war. Because, as I forget who, if the Middle East, who said this, if the Middle East were growing broccoli rather than oil, you could be sure that we wouldn't have too much interest. Just as we didn't have any interest in Rwanda and Sudan and other places where there are dictators galore, all right, why Saddam Hussein? All right, well, the answer is 60 miles away, you have oil fields, all right, in Kuwait and elsewhere. And the same is true of Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan, if you look at it on the map, represents a geographical area where there is oil in the southern republic of Turkestan, Turkmenistan, and so on, and there's a pipeline, all right, that goes 1,000 miles from there to Karachi, from where the oil is dispersed to parts of the world. Now, this has been going on for more than 100 years, all right, and hence has now acquired somewhat satirically the idea of the great game. The British, the French, the Russians, all sort of driven by their same addiction for oil as an energy resource, to try to get strategic hold of Afghanistan. And America is now the latest sort of player in that game. So